At 4:45 in the morning on September 1st, 1939, the silence of the Baltic harbor was shattered by the roar of naval guns. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, an aging vessel that had survived the Battle of Jutland in the last war, had arrived in Danzig 5 days earlier on what was described as a courtesy visit. The ship had anchored in the harbor, its crew mingling with the local population, its presence explained as a gesture of friendship to the free city that Germany claimed as its own. The Polish authorities had been suspicious but had allowed the visit to proceed. Diplomatic niceties still mattered in those final days of August. Now, in the pre-dawn darkness, the Schleswig-Holstein's 11-inch guns swung toward the Polish military transit depot at Westerplatte, a small peninsula at the mouth of the harbor where 182 Polish soldiers maintained a garrison. There was no warning. There was no declaration of war. There was only the thunder of artillery and the shriek of shells tearing through the air. The first salvo struck the Polish positions at 4:47 a.m. Buildings exploded. Trees were shredded. Men who had been sleeping moments before scrambled for their weapons, their ears ringing, their world transformed. Major Henryk Sucharski, the garrison commander, had known this moment might come. He had prepared his men as best he could. But nothing could truly prepare anyone for the reality of modern warfare descending upon them without warning. Simultaneously, across the length of the Polish frontier, 1.5 million German soldiers surged forward. In the north, Army Group North struck from East Prussia and Pomerania, driving toward Warsaw in the heart of Poland. In the south, Army Group South advanced from Silesia and Slovakia, aiming to encircle Polish forces in a vast pincer movement. Above them, the Luftwaffe, nearly 2,000 aircraft, swept across the border to destroy the Polish Air Force on the ground and bomb cities, railways, and troop concentrations. In Warsaw, the first air raid sirens began to wail at 6:00 a.m. Citizens who had gone to bed in peacetime woke to find themselves at war. Bombs fell on the Oaksey airfield, on railway stations, on military installations. Fires broke out across the city. The sky filled with smoke and the drone of aircraft engines. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler was awake and waiting. He had been at the Reich Chancellery since the small hours, receiving reports as the invasion unfolded. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The great gamble of his life was underway. Within weeks, he was certain, Poland would be destroyed. And the Western powers, Britain and France, who had guaranteed Polish independence, would do nothing. They would protest, they would threaten, but they would not fight. They never did. In London, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was awakened with the news he had dreaded. For 6 years, he had worked to prevent another European war. He had flown to Germany, had met with Hitler, and had made concessions that his critics called shameful. He had returned from Munich a year earlier, proclaiming peace for our time. Now that peace was shattered. The guarantees Britain had given to Poland would have to be honored, or Britain's word would mean nothing. And in Moscow, Joseph Stalin permitted himself a thin smile. The pact he had signed with Hitler just 9 days earlier had made this moment possible. Germany could attack Poland without fearing Soviet intervention. Indeed, the secret protocols of that pact had already divided Poland between them. Soon, Stalin would claim his share. The capitalist powers would destroy each other, and the Soviet Union would profit from their destruction. This is the story of the final days of peace in Europe. The Nazi-Soviet Pact stunned the world and sealed Poland's fate, of the last desperate negotiations that failed to prevent catastrophe, of the invasion that began the deadliest conflict in human history. This is the story of September 1939, the end of one world and the beginning of another. To understand why war came in September 1939, we must begin with the most shocking diplomatic reversal of the 20th century, the Nazi-Soviet Pact. For nearly 2 decades, Nazi Germany and Communist Russia had defined themselves as mortal enemies. Hitler had built his political career on anti-communism. He had denounced Bolshevism as a Jewish conspiracy to destroy civilization. He had sent German troops to fight alongside Franco against Soviet-backed republicans in Spain. The Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936 had aligned Germany with Japan against the Communist International. Every Nazi speech, every propaganda poster, Every rally had hammered home the message: communism was the enemy. Stalin, for his part, had watched Hitler's rise with growing alarm. The Nazi regime had destroyed the German Communist Party, imprisoned its leaders, and declared its intention to destroy the Soviet state. The Comintern had preached anti-fascism as the cause of the age. Soviet propaganda had portrayed Hitler as a mad dog who must be stopped. And yet, on the night of August 23, 1939, German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop flew to Moscow, and by 2:00 a.m. on August 24th, he and Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had signed a non-aggression pact. The two ideological enemies had become partners. The public provisions of the pact were straightforward enough. Germany and the Soviet Union agreed not to attack each other for 10 years. If either were attacked by a third power, the other would remain neutral. Trade agreements would be expanded, with Germany receiving Soviet raw materials and the Soviet Union receiving German manufactured goods. But the real significance lay in the secret protocol attached to the pact, a document whose existence the Soviet Union would deny for 50 years, until the original was finally discovered in Soviet archives after the Cold War ended. The secret protocol divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. In the event of a territorial and political rearrangement of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the northern boundary of Lithuania would mark the dividing line between German and Soviet spheres. Finland was assigned to the Soviet sphere. In Poland, the line would be drawn along the Narew, Vistula, and San rivers, roughly dividing the country in half. Bessarabia, the Romanian province that the Soviet Union had lost after the Russian Revolution, was recognized as a Soviet interest. In plain language, Hitler and Stalin had agreed to partition Eastern Europe between them. Poland would cease to exist. The Baltic states would fall under Soviet domination. The very people whose independence had been created at Versailles would be erased from the map. Why did Stalin make this deal with the devil? The Soviet dictator had been burned by the Western powers. He had watched them exclude the Soviet Union from the Munich Conference, where they had sacrificed Czechoslovakia to appease Hitler. He had concluded that Britain and France were trying to direct German aggression eastward, hoping that the fascists and communists would destroy each other while the capitalist democracies remained safe. Throughout the spring and summer of 1939, half-hearted negotiations had proceeded between the Western powers and Moscow. The British and French wanted Soviet support for their guarantee to Poland, but they were unwilling to offer the Soviets what they wanted: a free hand in the Baltic states and the right to send troops through Polish territory to meet a German attack. The Poles, remembering centuries of Russian domination, refused to allow Soviet troops on their soil. The negotiations dragged on without result. Meanwhile, Hitler made Stalin a better offer. Germany would recognize Soviet dominance in the Baltic. Germany would help the Soviet Union recover Bessarabia. Germany would share Poland with the Soviet Union. And Germany asked nothing in return except neutrality and raw materials to fuel the German war machine. Stalin's calculation was coldly rational. If he allied with the Western powers, the Soviet Union would bear the brunt of fighting Germany while Britain and France contributed little. If he allied with Germany, he could gain territory without war, buy time to build Soviet strength, and watch the capitalist powers destroy each other. When they were exhausted, the Soviet Union would be in a position to dictate terms. It was a cynical bargain, but Stalin was a cynical man. He had murdered millions of his own people in the purges and the famines. He had no moral qualms about sacrificing the Poles, the Balts, or anyone else who stood in his way. The Soviet Union's interests, as he defined them, were all that mattered. For Hitler, the pact was the key that unlocked the invasion of Poland. He had feared a two-front war, the nightmare that had destroyed Imperial Germany in 1918. Now his eastern flank was secure. The Soviet Union would not only remain neutral, but would actually participate in Poland's destruction. The British and French guarantee to Poland was rendered meaningless. Even if they declared war, they could not possibly reach Poland to help. Hitler could destroy his first target at leisure, then turn west to deal with France and Britain. When Ribbentrop telephoned Berlin with news that the pact was signed, Hitler reportedly slapped his thigh with delight. "I have them," he exclaimed. "I have them." The announcement of the Nazi-Soviet Pact hit the world like a thunderbolt. In the capitals of Western Europe, statesmen struggled to comprehend the reversal. Just days earlier, British and French negotiators had still been in Moscow, pursuing an alliance with Stalin. Now Stalin had aligned with Hitler. The strategic assumptions on which Western policy had been based were destroyed overnight. In Paris, Foreign Minister Georges Bonnet reportedly turned pale when he received the news. France had counted on the Soviet Union to threaten Germany's eastern frontier, to force Hitler to divide his forces in the event of war. That threat had evaporated. Germany could concentrate its full strength against Poland, then turn west with its rear secure. In London, the reaction was shock, but also a strange relief. The negotiations with Moscow had been tortured, the Soviet demands troubling. At least now the uncertainty was over. Britain knew where it stood. The question was whether the guarantee to Poland would still hold. Chamberlain summoned his cabinet and reaffirmed that Britain would honor its commitment to Poland. The guarantee was not contingent on Soviet support. If Germany attacked Poland, Britain would declare war. There would be no more Munichs. The line had been drawn. Parliament was recalled from its summer recess. On August 24th, the Emergency Powers Act was passed, giving the government sweeping authority to prepare for war. Reservists were called up. Air raid precautions were activated. Gas masks were distributed. The fleet was mobilized. In Poland, the news of the Nazi-Soviet Pact was received with grim determination. The Poles had always known they could not trust Russia. They had fought a war against the Bolsheviks in 1920 and had beaten them. They would not surrender their independence without a fight, regardless of the odds. Marshal Edward Rydz-Śmigły, the commander of Polish forces, ordered partial mobilization on August 24th. Full mobilization would follow on August 30th, delayed tragically by British and French pressure to avoid provoking Hitler. The delay would cost Poland precious days to prepare its defenses. Foreign Minister Joseph Beck spoke for his nation when he declared, "We in Poland do not know the concept of peace at any price. There is only one thing in the life of men, nations, and states which is without price, and that is honor." In Berlin, Hitler was making final preparations for the invasion. The original date had been set for August 26th, but it was postponed at the last minute when Mussolini informed Hitler that Italy was not ready for war and would remain neutral. Hitler needed a few more days to pressure Poland and to give the Western powers one last chance to abandon their ally. But Hitler did not expect the West to fight. He told his generals, "Our enemies are little worms. I saw them at Munich." He was convinced that Chamberlain and Daladier would find some excuse to back down, just as they had backed down over the Rhineland, over Austria, over Czechoslovakia. Poland would be destroyed, and the democracies would swallow their humiliation once again. This was Hitler's great miscalculation. He was right that Britain and France could not save Poland. He was wrong to think that they would not try. The final week of peace was a frenzy of diplomatic activity, last-minute proposals, and desperate hopes that somehow catastrophe could still be averted. On August 25th, the same day Hitler postponed the invasion, Britain and Poland signed a formal treaty of alliance. The guarantee was now a binding commitment. Any attack on Poland would be treated as an attack on Britain. Hitler responded by offering to negotiate. He proposed that Danzig be returned to Germany and that a plebiscite be held in the Polish corridor to determine its future. In exchange, he would guarantee Poland's remaining borders and conclude an alliance with Britain. The proposal was a sham, and everyone knew it. Hitler had no intention of honoring any agreement. He had made similar promises about Czechoslovakia and had broken them within months. But the proposal served his purpose. It created the appearance of German reasonableness and Polish intransigence. If war came, Germany could claim it had tried for peace. The British forwarded Hitler's proposals to Warsaw, urging the Poles to negotiate. The Poles were willing to discuss the issues but refused to negotiate under threat of invasion. They knew from Czechoslovakia's experience that negotiating with Hitler meant surrendering everything. Days of frantic diplomacy followed. Ambassadors shuttled between capitals. Messages flew back and forth. Intermediaries proposed compromises that neither side would accept. The Swedish businessman Birger Dolores, a friend of Hermann Göring, made multiple trips between Berlin and London, carrying unofficial proposals that never came to anything. Mussolini proposed a conference, an attempt to repeat the Munich formula. Britain was willing to consider it if German troops first withdrew from Polish soil, but German troops had not yet invaded. The proposal collapsed in confusion. Throughout this period, Hitler was not seriously negotiating. He was buying time to complete his military preparations, blaming war on Poland and the Western powers, and waiting for his enemies to lose their nerve. On August 28th, he informed his military commanders that the attack would begin on September 1st. The decision was final. On the afternoon of August 30th, the British government made one last attempt. It urged the Poles to open direct negotiations with Germany, to send an envoy to Berlin with full powers to negotiate. The Poles reluctantly agreed to consider German proposals, but refused to send an envoy to Berlin. They remembered how Austrian Chancellor Schuschnigg had been bullied by Hitler at Berchtesgaden. That evening, the British ambassador, Sir Neville Henderson, met with Ribbentrop to receive Germany's proposals. Ribbentrop produced a document with 16 points, relatively moderate demands regarding Danzig and the corridor, and read them aloud at high speed in German, refusing to give Henderson a copy. When Henderson asked for the text, Ribbentrop said it was too late. Poland had not sent a plenipotentiary, so the proposals were moot. The entire exercise was a theater. Hitler never intended to negotiate. The 16 points were drafted not to be accepted, but to be rejected, providing a pretext for war. By the time Henderson reported to London, German troops were already moving into their attack positions. The final provocation came on the night of August 31st, 1939. At 8:00 p.m., a group of SS men dressed in Polish military uniforms attacked the German radio station at Gleiwitz, near the Polish border. They burst into the station, fired shots, broadcast a brief anti-German message in Polish, and fled, leaving behind the body of a concentration camp prisoner named Francis Zechoniak, who had been killed by lethal injection, and then shot to make it appear he had been killed in the fighting. The Gleiwitz incident was only the largest of several staged provocations along the frontier that night. At other locations, SS operatives in Polish uniforms attacked German installations, leaving behind more dead bodies, all concentration camp inmates who had been murdered for the purpose. The operations were organized by Reinhard Heydrich and carried out by the SD. The purpose was to create evidence of Polish aggression, to justify the German invasion as self-defense. German radio broadcast breathless reports of Polish attacks on German soil. The Nazi press screamed about Polish atrocities. None of it was true, but truth was irrelevant. In the small hours of September 1st, German forces began moving toward the Polish border. Tanks rumbled down roads in the darkness. Infantry marched in long columns. Aircraft warmed their engines on airfields across eastern Germany. The final orders had been given. There was no going back. At 4:45 a.m., the Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on Westerplatte. The Second World War had begun. The invasion of Poland was the first demonstration of a new form of warfare that would revolutionize military operations: Blitzkrieg lightning war. German doctrine combined three elements in a way that no army had done before: air power to achieve local superiority and disrupt enemy communications, armored forces to penetrate enemy lines and encircle defensive positions, and motorized infantry to exploit the breakthroughs and complete the destruction of surrounded forces. The Luftwaffe struck first. In the pre-dawn darkness, German bombers and fighters swept across the Polish frontier, targeting airfields, railway junctions, communication centers, and troop concentrations. The Polish Air Force, though it had some modern fighters, was outnumbered roughly 10-1. Many aircraft were destroyed on the ground in the first hours. Those who survived fought bravely but were overwhelmed. The bombing extended to cities. Warsaw was hit on the first day, though the major terror bombing would come later. Other cities, Krakow, Lodz, Częstochowa, were struck as well. Refugees began fleeing eastward almost immediately, clogging roads that the Polish army needed for movement. On the ground, German forces attacked on multiple axes. In the north, General Fedor von Bock's Army Group North struck from East Prussia and Pomerania, aiming to destroy Polish forces in the corridor and drive toward Warsaw from the north. In the south, General Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group South advanced from Silesia and Slovakia, with the largest concentration of armor, aiming to encircle the main Polish forces in western Poland. The Polish army was substantial, perhaps 1 million men when fully mobilized, but it was deployed to defend the entire frontier, a strategy that spread forces thin and left them vulnerable to concentration. Polish commanders had planned to defend western Poland, including the industrial regions of Upper Silesia, rather than fall back to more defensible positions behind the Vistula and San rivers. This decision, driven by political considerations, Poland could not simply abandon its most valuable territories, would prove disastrous. The German armor punched through Polish lines with stunning speed. The Polish army had few tanks and limited anti-tank weapons. Its cavalry brigades, though they did not actually charge tanks with lances, as Nazi propaganda later claimed, were hopelessly outclassed by mechanized forces. Within days, German spearheads had penetrated deep into Polish territory, bypassing strong points and encircling entire Polish armies. The Luftwaffe's dominance of the skies made Polish movement almost impossible. Any concentration of troops was bombed and strafed. Railways were cut, bridges were destroyed, communications broke down. Polish commanders lost contact with their units. Orders were issued but never received. Units fought bravely in isolation, not knowing what was happening elsewhere. By September 5th, German forces had broken through the Polish corridor, linking East Prussia with the rest of Germany. By September 8th, German armor reached the outskirts of Warsaw. The Polish army was disintegrating, not from lack of courage, but from the sheer speed and violence of the German assault. The Polish resistance, though ultimately futile, was fierce and heroic. At Westerplatte, Major Sucharski's 182 soldiers held out for 7 days against repeated German assaults. The garrison had been designed for only a week's resistance, and it achieved exactly that. When Sucharski finally surrendered on September 7, his men marched out with military honors, saluted by their German captors who respected their courage. At Hel Peninsula, the Polish naval base held out until October 2nd, a month of resistance against overwhelming odds. At Modlin, the fortress held until September 29th. At Lwów, the garrison resisted until September 22nd, and Warsaw itself refused to fall. The city was surrounded by September 15th, but it did not surrender. For 2 weeks, soldiers and civilians alike defended the capital. German artillery pounded the city. The Luftwaffe bombed it mercilessly. Food ran short, water became scarce, fires burned out of control. On September 25th, the Luftwaffe launched its heaviest raid of the campaign. Over 400 bombers dropped incendiaries and high explosives on Warsaw in a terror attack designed to break the will of the defenders. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Hospitals were hit. Civilians died in their thousands. Still, Warsaw fought. Mayor Stefan Starzyński broadcast daily on the radio, rallying his people, becoming a symbol of Polish resistance. "I wanted Warsaw to be great," he said. "I believed it would be great." My colleagues and I drew plans for a great Warsaw of the future. And Warsaw is great. It is happening faster than we thought. The city finally surrendered on September 27th after 26 days of siege. Over 25,000 civilians had been killed. Much of the city lay in ruins. But the defenders had shown that Polish resistance would not be easily crushed. While Poland fought alone, the Western powers hesitated. Britain and France had declared war on September 3rd, but their declarations were not accompanied by any military action. The French army, the largest in Western Europe, made a tentative advance into the Saar region, occupying a few miles of German territory against minimal opposition. Then it stopped. By September 12th, the French began withdrawing to the Maginot Line. No Allied soldiers would fire a shot in defense of Poland. The British Expeditionary Force began deploying to France, but its first units did not arrive until late September, and they would not be in position for months. The Royal Air Force dropped propaganda leaflets over Germany, paper, not bombs. The Royal Navy began implementing a blockade of German ports, a strategy that would take years to have any effect. The Poles had expected more. Their military planning had assumed that France would launch a major offensive within 2 weeks of the war's outbreak, forcing Germany to divert forces from Poland. When no offensive came, Polish hopes collapsed. They were fighting alone, and there would be no help. Why did the Western powers not attack? The answer is complex. French military doctrine was entirely defensive. The Maginot Line mentality had infected the entire army. French commanders believed that offensive operations were impossible against modern defenses, that attackers would be slaughtered as they had been in 1914-1918. They preferred to wait, to build up strength, to let the blockade weaken Germany over time. The British had almost no army to send. The BEF was small and would take months to deploy. The RAF was husbanding its strength for the expected German bombing campaign against Britain. Neither Britain nor France was psychologically ready for offensive action, and there was perhaps a secret hope that somehow, even now, the war might be ended without serious fighting. Perhaps Hitler would be satisfied with Poland. Perhaps a negotiated peace could still be found. Perhaps the horror of another world war could still be avoided. These hopes were delusional, but they influenced policy. The result was that Poland was left to die alone, while its allies watched from the safety of their fortifications. The final blow came from the east. On September 17, 1939, Soviet forces crossed the Polish frontier. The Red Army attacked with over 600,000 troops, striking across an almost undefended border. The Polish army had concentrated in the west against Germany. The Soviets claimed they were intervening to protect the Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities of eastern Poland, to restore order after the collapse of the Polish state. It was a transparent lie. The Soviet Union was collecting its share of the spoils agreed in the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Polish resistance in the east was minimal. The remaining Polish forces, already shattered by the German onslaught, could not fight on two fronts. Some units attempted to break through to Romania or Hungary, hoping to regroup and continue the fight from abroad. Others surrendered to the Soviets, expecting to be treated as prisoners of war. They would not be treated as prisoners of war. The Soviets arrested Polish officers, government officials, police, and anyone else deemed a threat to Soviet rule. Many were deported to labor camps in Siberia. In the spring of 1940, on Stalin's orders, the NKVD would execute approximately 22,000 Polish officers and intellectuals in what became known as the Katyn Massacre. The crime would be hidden for decades, blamed on the Nazis, until finally acknowledged by the Soviet government in 1990. On September 28th, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a new agreement, the German-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Demarcation. The treaty finalized the partition of Poland. The border between German and Soviet zones was adjusted slightly from the original pact, with Germany taking more of central Poland in exchange for Soviet control of Lithuania. A joint declaration called for the end of the war, now that the former Polish state had ceased to exist. Poland was gone, partitioned between its enemies, erased from the map of Europe. The nation that had been reborn at Versailles, after 123 years of partition, had lasted barely 20 years before being partitioned again. But Poland was not destroyed. A government in exile was established, first in France and later in Britain. Polish soldiers who escaped, over 100,000 of them, would continue fighting alongside the Allies throughout the war. Polish pilots would distinguish themselves in the Battle of Britain. Polish codebreakers had already provided crucial intelligence on the German Enigma machine. And within Poland itself, an underground resistance would begin almost immediately, fighting on for 6 years of brutal occupation. Poland had been defeated. Poland had not been conquered. On September 3, 1939, Neville Chamberlain announced Britain's declaration of war in a radio broadcast that captured the anguish of a man who had spent his career trying to prevent this very moment. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that, unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland. a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany." Chamberlain's voice was heavy with sorrow. He continued, "You can imagine what a bitter blow it is to me that all my long struggle to win peace has failed. Yet I cannot believe that there is anything more or anything different that I could have done, and that would have been more successful." In Paris, Premier Adé de Leyde delivered a similar announcement to the French people. France, too, was at war. For the generation that had lived through 1914-1918, the news brought a particular horror. They remembered the trenches, the gas attacks, the endless casualty lists. They had promised themselves, never again, and now it was happening again. Their sons would march off to war as they had marched, and many would not return. In London, crowds gathered outside Downing Street and Buckingham Palace. There was no cheering as there had been in 1914. The mood was grim, determined, fearful. People knew what was coming. They did not know how bad it would be. Winston Churchill, the persistent critic of appeasement who had been brought into the cabinet as First Lord of the Admiralty, addressed the House of Commons. "Outside, the storms of war may blow, and the lands may be lashed with the fury of its gales, but in our own hearts this Sunday morning, there is peace. Our hands may be active, but our consciences are at rest. We are fighting to save the whole world from the pestilence of Nazi tyranny and in defense of all that is most sacred to man." Churchill at least had no illusions about what lay ahead. He had been warning for years that this moment would come. Now it had come, and the struggle for survival had begun. The September campaign ended with Poland's partition, but its consequences would resonate throughout the war. The Wehrmacht had demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of blitzkrieg. The campaign had taken just over a month and had cost Germany fewer than 20,000 dead, a remarkably low figure for the conquest of a nation of 35 million people. Polish military casualties were approximately 66,000 killed, with over 400,000 captured by the Germans and another 200,000 by the Soviets. The German officer corps, which had been skeptical of Hitler's aggressive policies, was now convinced that the Führer's military judgment was sound. The generals who had warned that war with the West would be disastrous were discredited. Hitler's prestige soared. His confidence in his own genius became unshakable, a confidence that would eventually lead to catastrophic mistakes. For the Western powers, the campaign was a sobering demonstration of German military capability. The speed of Poland's defeat shocked military observers. The coordination of air and ground forces, the deep penetrations by armored columns, the encirclement and destruction of entire armies, all of this would have to be countered if Germany was to be defeated. But instead of learning the lessons of Poland, the French and British military establishments largely dismissed them. Poland was weak, they told themselves. The Polish army was outdated. The same thing could not happen to France with its modern army and impregnable fortifications. This complacency would prove fatal when Germany turned west. For the Polish people, the September campaign was the beginning of a nightmare. The German occupation would be the most brutal in Western Europe. Poland was not treated as a conquered country, but as a colonial territory to be exploited and eventually cleansed of its population. Jews were immediately subjected to persecution, forced labor, confiscation of property, and concentration in ghettos. Within 2 years, the death camps would begin operating on Polish soil. The Soviet occupation of eastern Poland was scarcely less brutal. Mass deportations to Siberia, executions of class enemies, forced collectivization, the suppression of the Polish language and culture. The two totalitarian systems, Nazi and Soviet, competed in their cruelty toward the Polish people. And yet Poland resisted. The Underground Home Army, the largest resistance organization in occupied Europe, would fight on throughout the war. Polish intelligence would continue to provide vital information to the Allies. The Polish government in exile would never accept defeat. When the war ended, Poland would rise again. As September 1939 ended, the shape of the war was still uncertain. Germany had conquered Poland, but was now at war with Britain and France. The Soviet Union had gained territory but remained officially neutral. Italy had stayed out Mussolini, judging his country unready for a major conflict. The United States was determinedly neutral, its people opposed to involvement in another European war. Japan was bogged down in China, its ambitions in Asia not yet linked to the European conflict. The phony war was about to begin. Months of inactivity on the Western Front while Germany digested its conquest and prepared for the next phase. The period would be characterized by waiting, by uncertainty, by the strange sensation of being at war without fighting. But the die had been cast. The decisions that led to war had been made, and they could not be unmade. Hitler had revealed his true nature. The Nazi-Soviet Pact had shown that no agreement with totalitarian powers could be trusted. The Western democracies had finally drawn a line they would not cross. The lessons of the 1930s had been learned too late to save Poland, but they had been learned. There would be no more appeasement. There would be no negotiated peace that left Hitler in power. The war would be fought to the finish, whatever the cost. As the guns fell silent over the ruins of Warsaw, as the last Polish units surrendered or escaped into exile, as the German and Soviet occupiers began their work of oppression, the world understood that an era had ended. The fragile peace that had followed the First World War was gone. The hopes of the League of Nations, of collective security, of a world without war, all of these lay buried in the rubble of Polish cities. In their place was a new reality, total war between ideologies that could not coexist, between fundamentally incompatible systems, between visions of humanity that could not be reconciled. The Second World War would be fought not just for territory or resources, but for the very definition of what human civilization would become. The road to catastrophe had reached its end. The catastrophe itself had just begun. One Polish soldier, escaping across the Romanian border with the remnants of his unit, later wrote of those final days, "We had fought with everything we had. We had been promised help from the West that never came. We had been stabbed in the back by the Soviets. We had seen our country torn apart, our cities bombed, our people murdered, but we had not given up." As I crossed the frontier into Romania, I looked back at the land I was leaving. I did not know if I would ever see it again. I did not know if Poland would ever rise again. But I knew that I would keep fighting. We all would. Poland was not dead. It was in us, in every soldier who escaped, in every family that resisted, in every heart that refused to surrender. The war had begun, and we would see it through to the end. Next time, we will witness the wholesale destruction of Poland under Nazi and Soviet occupation. We will see the beginning of the Holocaust, the establishment of the ghettos, and the creation of the system that would murder millions. We will examine how Poland's resistance began, even as its nation was dismembered, and how the Polish people endured the darkest chapter of their history. The invasion had ended, the occupation and the horror was about to begin.